And so, in 1933, we certainly have a change of events, as I'll describe here in just a moment. But certainly one of the things that happened in conjunction with this was the development as an offshoot from the Bureau of Internal Revenue. There was an agency which was created, which was known as the Internal Revenue Service. Now, this Internal Revenue Service is actually a trust that exists in Puerto Rico. Now, in today's world, the Internal Revenue Service, of course, is directly linked to the International Monetary Fund, and maybe I'll discuss that just in a moment. But in any event, in 1935, or let me make sure my date on this now. It's either 33 or 35. It's 33. In 1933, and we have the charter here to look at, but in 1933, the Internal Revenue Service from Puerto Rico moved onshore in basically what we call the United States. Anyway, it moved onshore as a corporation which was chartered in Delaware. And it became known as the Internal Revenue Tax and Audit Services Incorporated. So what we're dealing with onshore in the United States is a corporation which is chartered in Delaware, obviously for the tax for the tax benefits that come from a Delaware incorporation. So anyway, I'm explaining this history so that people will understand just exactly what it is that they are dealing with here in the United States when they're faced with difficulties. And that is, they simply have to understand that they're dealing with a corporation, and the connection to the corporation that they're dealing with is through the what's called the SS5 form application. Anyway, the SS5 is an application for a Social Security account. And that Social Security account, because obviously we're under bankruptcy, is handled as a trust. Now, on this Social Security trust, certainly it is based upon the birth certificate that is created by the state where you were born. Now, you have to understand that what we call the straw man was actually created by your birth state, and then through the SS5 form, the United States was able to subrogate the benefits that came from the birth certificate for its use. Now, as I mentioned, that SS5 form created a situation whereas the trust that was thus created is operated as a cestacay trust. And what that means is the cestacay is operated for the beneficiaries. Now, on this trust, you are not the beneficiary of that trust. You are construed to be the trustee of that trust. And so the difficulty that most people are having is because they have not properly dealt with the trust that was created by your signature on the SS5 form. And so I've kind of brought it up current here. Tad, if you have some questions about the history of this situation, certainly I'd be happy to answer some of those if I know the answer.
Actually, a lot of what you've talked about is new to me. I've heard about M1 before. My understanding was that was from families all over the world, and that they had started that about 500 years ago. I don't know if that's the correct timeline or not.
No, that's probably a little bit. It actually was started. The movement to do that kind of thing was actually during the 1700s by Saint Germain. So it's actually only talking about less than 300 years.
Okay, and the M1 now is actually based in China, is what I've heard. Or the latest.
Negative on that. The evolution of that whole process. Well, let me just bring it down. Let me give some more history so that you'll understand. Now, those accounts and those trusts that claimed the ownership of the assets in gold and other precious, perhaps jewels and so forth and so on, for a long time was administered perhaps a little bit loosely. And M1 was, in fact, and I forgot his name. It kind of escapes me right now. But he's referred to as M1, and eventually he was captured,
right,
and held hostage. And I think he died in 1928. And so around this period of time, and certainly leading up to the World War II, historically those assets were in a bit of flux. But again, the trust held the ownership of the assets and so forth, and so I would suppose that there was, much interaction by the trustees of those trusts and so forth in regards to these matters. And these things are handled certainly at the highest levels on a national basis and so forth. And so it certainly is not general information, and it's not general news. But what did happen as a result of World War II, in conjunction with the original design, to eradicate colonialism, it was agreed upon in 1945 to create a commission to administer these accounts, for the benefit of the planet, and certainly as a safeguard against colonialism and so forth. A commission was created, and there were 3 trustee nations that were given pretty much unlimited power to administer these things. And those 3 nations were the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. And this commission was given for 50 years. Well, if you study the history, for that 50-year period of the U.S., U.K., and France, you'll find that they, in fact, did not fulfill their obligation to eradicate colonialism, but they simply just promoted it.
Right.
And so after the 50-year period was over with, the commission was disbanded and not recommissioned. And so the assets in 1995 were consolidated under an organization which is known as the International Treasury. It evolved into what's known as the Office of International Treasury Control. Now, the Office of International Treasury Control is actually administered under treaty through the United Nations treaties and so forth by one man who is known as, even though it's not his real name, it's the name that they have given him, but he is known as His Excellency Dr. Ray C. Dam. His principal location is in Asia. Many times he's in Cambodia or wherever. I think he's on the move quite a bit trying to get some of these things regulated. So in 1995, under international treaty, the sole responsibility in regards to the assets of these trusts were vested in one man. And so in 1995, he went to work to try to correct many of the problems that had been created by the 50-year reign of that commission. And so since 1995, certainly he's been working to try to get some of those things straightened out, and with a great deal of difficulty, it appears.
Okay. Because the people controlling those accounts have been raiding those accounts, and it's like they're addicted to crack. They don't want to give it up.
Well, most of the problems has been by banks and countries and so forth that did not have any right to use the assets, but simply counterfeited their right to use. Now, one of the purposes of the accounts, that came from the trust, the collateral accounts and so forth. The gold that was actually a part of that trust has been distributed through the world, and is in many instances is held by national governments. For instance, the gold that is supposedly in Fort Knox is on loan from the collateral accounts for the purpose, that the country or nation or whatever can use that as a surety, for their commercial affairs. For which, for the use of that gold, there is a custodial, premium, if I can use that word, or a rent for the use of the gold. And so that premium, of course, has to be paid back to source, which in this case is OITC. And in far too many instances, that premium is simply not being paid and being perhaps either misused or stolen. And so these are some of the problems that certainly come up, as these funds and these accounts and so forth are trying to be administered. So we certainly run into these problems as we go along. And I can't hardly imagine the headaches that have to go with that. But in any event, if you study the evolution of this whole thing, the gold that belongs to the trust was taken to Philippines, was to be the revenue of which was to be administered by the Bureau of Internal Revenue, and then in conjunction with that, and in conjunction with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, the Internal Revenue Service was created in Puerto Rico, and then in conjunction with that, when they came on shore with that, they incorporated in Delaware as the Internal Revenue Tax and Audit Service. And so when you're dealing with things here in the United States as United States citizens, you have to understand that you're dealing with a corporation, which we generally refer to as the IRS, but the full name of that organization is, in fact, Internal Revenue Tax and Audit Service. And if you look at that word service, you'll simply recognize that what you're dealing with here is a debt servicer. And so that's what they're doing, is they're collecting on the debt that's owed on the premium for the use of the gold that's under control of, at this present date, the Office of International Treasury Control.
And that's what the income tax is?
Well, there's no such thing as income tax, so we ought not use that word.
All right. Well,
let me go back in history and explain another concept, and that is the concept of a constitutor, Tax and Audit Services Incorporated. So what we're dealing with onshore in the United States is a corporation which is chartered in Delaware, obviously for the tax for the tax benefits that come from a Delaware incorporation. So anyway, I'm explaining this history so that people will understand just exactly what it is that they are dealing with here in the United States when they're faced with difficulties. And that is, they simply have to understand that they're dealing with a corporation, and the connection to the corporation that they're dealing with is through the what's called the SS5 form application. Anyway, the SS5 is an application for a Social Security account. Internal Revenue Service is actually a trust that exists in Puerto Rico. Now, in today's world, the Internal Revenue Service, of course, is directly linked to the International Monetary Fund, and maybe I'll discuss that just in a moment. But in any event, in 1935, or let me make sure my date on this now. It's either 33 or 35. It's 33. In 1933, and we have the charter here to look at, but in 1933, the Internal Revenue Service from Puerto Rico moved onshore in basically what we call the United States. Anyway, it moved onshore as a corporation which was chartered in Delaware. And it became known as the Internal Revenue. And so, in 1933, we certainly have a change of events, as I'll describe here in just a moment. But certainly one of the things that happened in conjunction with this was the development as an offshoot from the Bureau of Internal Revenue. There was an agency which was created, which was known as the Internal Revenue Service. Now, this